start with Professor Amir Harak. Each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes, and we will leave the questions and answer for the end of the panel. And at the end, we will open it to question and answers, and we will be following the program you have here. Although you do have the bios of the speakers, I will still read them. And the reason I'm doing so is that we're being televised, and the program will be webcast on the library's website. And so for people around the world who will be seeing this program, we are just a small fraction of the people who will be seeing this program. There will be programs, once it's webcast, then it's picked up by YouTube, it's picked up by other organizations, and we have found out that our programs are seen literally in every corner of the world. So I will begin with introducing Professor Harak. He's a professor of Aramaic and Syriac studies at the University of Toronto. He studied philosophy and theology at St. John's Seminary in Mosul, Iraq. And in 1980, he obtained 3 licence degrees in church history, Oriental studies, and archaeology and art history from the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium. He received his PhD in 1987 in Assyriology from the University of Toronto, Canada, and the next year began a teaching career at the same university. Among his latest publications are the 2-volume on Syriac and Gershuni inscriptions of Iraq, published in 2010 by the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres in Paris, and the catalogue of Syriac and Gershuni manuscripts, CSCO Subsidia, Louvain. He is also the founder and the current president of the Canadian Society for Syriac Studies and the general editor of its journal. Professor Amir Harak will now give a talk and a power presentation on the Neo-Assyrian winged bulls and their origins. Professor Harak.
Thank you, Tati. Good morning, everyone. I will talk about winged bulls and beyond. I would like to talk a little bit about other stoneworks as well as ivory and jewelry, and you will see that it is quite fascinating. Between the 9th and 7th centuries BC, Assyria built the first empire, which extended from western Persia to the Mediterranean and from northern Mesopotamia and Syria to Egypt. The empire was consolidated by a powerful military machine and a sophisticated administrative system, both reflected in native annals and state archives. The empire also produced remarkable works of art, low-relief sculptures, wall paintings, jewelry and ivory carvings, which add fineness and elegance to mighty Assyria. We shall survey this great wealth of art, which had reached new and sometimes unique standards. The Assyrian stonecutters and artists expressed some of their religious beliefs in their stoneworks. The gateways of palaces and temples were all flanked by winged bulls and lions, which they took for guardians of gates and entrances. Since the 3rd millennium BC in Mesopotamia, supernatural beings were conceived as being combinations of a human and animal elements, and thus we see in art human-headed bulls and lions, and statues of half-man, half-bull or lion. During the 13th century BC, the Assyrians added another element to these monsters, wings, to highlight their celestial nature. Thus, winged men and winged bulls and lions began to appear in a variety of positions, as you can see in the seals here. Figures that quickly spread out from Assyria to the rest of Mesopotamia and Upper Syria. As Assyria progressively became an unmatched superpower at the dawn of the first millennium BC, Assyrians turned the monsters into colossi, placed almost always at gateways. Here they play two roles, architectural and religious. In architecture, the colossi are mere jumps, upon which arches of gates and doorways rest, and in religion, they are protective deities, not much different from the Judeo-Christian concept of angels. There are three main types of colossi. The centaur, made of the upper body of man and the lower body of lion, attested monumentally only during the 9th century BC. The anthropomorphic winged bull and the anthropomorphic winged lion. The latter two are known from the 9th to the 7th centuries. The Assyrians portrayed these monsters with stylistic features known to the Assyrians of that period. They all wear cylindrical tiaras with horns seen in other deities, but the earrings hanging from the ears of some of the colossi are also worn by Assyrian kings and dignitaries. Some were found in archaeological digs, in fact. The hair which covers the cheeks, the chin and part of the chest, and which also at the back of the head, is always plaited, just as the hair of contemporary kings and people is. In the depiction of colossi and people, the eyebrows are thick and continuous, the eyes are bulgy, and the nose is slightly round, anatomical features known to Mediterranean people in general. One of the more remarkable Assyrian achievements in art is to express in the same word different positions at the same time. Some of the colossi are depicted with 5 legs to be seen in profile in a walking position, as if patrolling, and in front in a resting position of guards and entrances. This peculiar anatomical feature dates to the 9th century BC, but Assyrians expressed it already during the 13th century in a relief showing King Tukulti-Ninurta I in 2 worshipping attitudes, standing and kneeling. The fact that the Assyrian artists at the time of Ashurbanipal, 7th century BC, also depicted a hunted lion in 3 positions, coming out of the cage, moving toward the king and jumping at him, highlights a centuries-old practice among the Assyrians. The colossi are mentioned in Assyrian royal inscriptions, naming them and defining their functions within the palace. The 2 frequent names are the Lamassatu, she's a female, or Lamassu and Shedu. The Lamassu may have its origin in the Sumerian protective goddess Lamma, and is always a good genius, a good spirit. By contrast, the name Shedu refers to 2 different spirits, one good and one bad. But when Shedu accompanies the name of Lamassu, Shedu is always the good spirit. Modern Assyrians know the name Sheda, devil, from which the word Shedana, devilish or foolish person, derives. I will expand now to talk a little bit about low reliefs. The Assyrian artists also worked with stone slabs, recording religious, military, and hunting scenes carved in low relief. Since ancient Mesopotamian buildings were constructed with mud bricks, stone slabs were placed against their lower walls in protection. The local limestone was readily available in Assyria and and with it until recently, churches, synagogues, mosques, and houses were constructed. The practice of depicting sceneries on such slabs is known in Mesopotamia and Syria, but the majority of the Assyrian art, even in the 9th century, indicates an indigenous practice dated much earlier than that century. The first depicted slabs date to the time of the 9th century Ashur-Nasirpal I in his capital city, Kalkhu, nowadays called Nimrud. The scenery is essentially religious, and even when it includes hunting episodes. It shows the king with a variety of winged genies, including eagle-headed men and winged men, standing or kneeling on both sides of a stylized tree. The genies hold pails and cones, while the king carries a libation bowl in the right hand and holds a staff with the left hand. In another cultic scene, the king is seen seated with a bowl in his hand and surrounded by attendants and genies. Military and hunting scenes dominated art of the 8th and 7th centuries BC, in line with the territorial expansion of Assyria. In both cases, the king is the focus of the scenes, with no place for genies or other divinities, including the national god Ashur. We see the king participating in warfare and hunting wild animals, namely lions, and in both cases, he is depicted as a human being, proving his prowess in hunting. Military scenes include sieges, deportations, and impaling, violent tactics used by all ancient nations. Even in this brutal context, the Assyrian artists added environmental sceneries, including rivers filled with fish and crabs, mountains covered with trees and shrubs, and all kinds of birds flying in the open skies. Lines of soldiers and prisoners of war are traced symmetrically and harmoniously with lines of trees. And since this arrangement recurs nearly in all military scenes, it is as if the artist evoked nature in otherwise bloody events. In the siege of Lachish, a biblical city in Israel, which the late century Sennacherib sacked, the artist produced a well-conceived composition. The scene begins at the bottom, with the drafted armies marching toward the city of Lachish located in the middle of the way, and then progresses toward the seated king who occupies the top of the composition. The military scenes include a variety of weapons, siege engines, defensive tactics, and different ranks of soldiers. The artists also traced the topography of foreign countries. For example, here we have boats, whether they are maritime, mountainous, or just plain lands. Foreign people are depicted by the way they physically looked and dressed up, and the type of works they undertook. Beside military events, peace treaties are fittingly recorded. In the scene shown in the throne of King Shalmaneser III, the treaty between warring kings is concluded by probably the first political handshaking. Rare scene even in antiquity, and you can see them shaking the hands. Hunting depictions are particularly interesting because they show striking realism never detected in ancient art. Hunted lions are shown suffering, reeling, and agonizing. But one lioness, defiant, even while succumbing to arrows penetrating her body. No artist in antiquity had ever reached the artistic standard that the Assyrians had so brilliantly achieved in art. Artists also portrayed people hunting wild animals and birds as seen in some delightful scenes. The military and hunting activities were also painted on walls with vivid colors and gracious lines. They survived in a few Assyrian provincial cities of Syria. The painting reflects the ability of the Assyrian artists to work with pigments and drawings, creating charming sceneries. Ivory works. A great number of ivory objects were uncovered in Assyria, especially in the capital, Calhoun, Nimrud. While the art of these objects betrays Egyptian and Syrian influences, some objects exhibit Mesopotamian motifs. Since the Assyrians were brilliant in art, some ivory works must have been produced by Assyrian craftsmen in Assyria. One can admire what I call the Assyrian Mona Lisa. With her subtle smile, the Phoenician-looking lady of the window, at the window, and the truly delightful cow, suckling her calf while turning her head toward the latter in affection. Even if these works may not be Assyrian, they tell much about the fineness and charm of their owners, since the Assyrians used them to ornate their chairs, beds, thrones, and other pieces of furniture. Lastly, jewelry work. In producing jewelry, the Assyrians reached such a professional standard that not even our modern machines can reach. I am not exaggerating. A cache of jewels was uncovered in Nimrud in 1989 in royal graves, and it is so stunning that the King Tut treasure looks quite pale in comparison with it. The treasure of Nimrud includes pairs of earrings with hanging bells, pomegranate-shaped pendants, solid gold bracelets, pairs of cuffs made of heavy gold, bangles, anklets, and the truly unique and splendid headband. The headband is made of fine woven herringbone patterned gold strands and consists of 6 gold ribbons connected by hinges with 5 discs each inlaid with a round precious stone, and a rectangular plaque decorated with rosettes around its edges. The plaque is inlaid with 2 square precious stones and with tassels attached to its lower edge. The gold necklace is made of a tube incised with alternating vertical and horizontal wavy lines. 28 almond-shaped pendants are suspended around the tube by a gold wire passing through rings. Its clasp is made of 2 entwined dragon's head, a Mesopotamian motif that continued to be seen in the art of medieval churches in the north of Iraq. One would add 4 gold bowls, 2 of which inscribed with names of Assyrian queens. In producing these gold vessels, the Assyrian goldsmith imitated bowls made of exceptionally thin walls, called by archaeologists palaceware, that is abundantly found in Nimrud. In conclusion, Assyrian artists added elegance to an empire known for its military prowess and its administrative rigor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Harar. That was really beautiful and inspiring. And now we're going to have Professor Woods, who's Associate Professor of Soberology in the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, and whose paper is there's a change in the title. Gilgamesh in its ancient and modern context. Professor Woods teaches in the Oriental Institute at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, and the program in the Ancient Mediterranean World of the University of Chicago. He received his bachelor's degree from Yale University and his PhD in Assyriology from Harvard University. He was a junior fellow in the Harvard Society of Fellows before joining the faculty of the University of Chicago. His research interests include Sumerian writing and language, as well as early Mesopotamian religion, literature, and administration. He is currently completing 2 monographs, including one entitled Gilgamesh in Sumerian Literary Tradition for the SPL series in Writing of the Ancient World, which will provide new translations and commentary for the 6 Gilgamesh tales preserved in Sumerian. So, Professor Woods.
So I want to thank the organizers, in particular Eden Navi, for the invitation to speak on Gilgamesh at this first ever conference on the Assyrian legacy here at the Library of Congress in this really impressive building. It's a great honor for me to be here. So as the wonderful introduction just mentioned, what I'd like to do today is speak about the history and context of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and concluding with a focus on the role of 2 prominent Assyrians in this story. One, its greatest patron in antiquity, and the other, its modern discoverer. But first, what is the Epic of Gilgamesh about? Well, it's human mortality and the fear of death are the principal themes. The death of Gilgamesh's companion, Enkidu, after a series of shared adventures, sets Gilgamesh on a quest to meet the immortal survivor of the flood, Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, to learn the secret of immortality. It's a quest, of course, in which he ultimately fails but acquires a great deal of wisdom in the process. So the epic is about the acquisition of self-knowledge as well as the divinely ordained scheme of things, a wisdom that the gods gave to humans in the antediluvian age before the flood, but was lost with the flood. We, of course, celebrate Gilgamesh as the first masterpiece of world literature, and certainly today it's the best-known Mesopotamian composition. But what we often overlook is that Gilgamesh also had a substantial following in antiquity, to judge by its wide circulation and longevity and artistic representation. It enjoyed popularity in the ancient world as well. The major themes of the epic resonate with us just as much as they did with the ancients. And this is what gives the epic its universal and timeless appeal. Here you have an example of first millennium BC cylinder seal. It depicts Gilgamesh and Enkidu dispatching the bull of heaven as it's recounted in tablet 6 of the epic. Here is a relief of a hero which many people, it's not definite, but many people have wanted to identify with Gilgamesh, overpowered the lion. This is from the throne room of Sargon II. At the very least, it recalls a passage from the beginning of tablet 9 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh, distraught after the death of Enkidu, reverts to this primitive state, becoming a sort of child of nature, before beginning his quest to seek out Utnapishtim. In the epic, of course, we have Humbaba, who's the protector of the cedar forest. He's decapitated by Enkidu, and we have a great variety of mask-like representations from Mesopotamia depicting the head of Humbaba that were used as probably protective amulets, and these have also survived in the archaeological record. Now, images from the epic, particularly those involving Humbaba, these were very, very very popular. They like this part of the story a lot. And his slang are found really far and wide in Mesopotamia. Again, a testament to the epic in antiquity and its popularity. We have here this piece from the Old Babylonian period, from the 2nd millennium BC. Another piece all the way up from the Anatolian capital in Turkey, and even in southeast Iran. Now, Gilgamesh is at present a damaged and only partially complete masterpiece. What you see here are some of the largest fragments of the epic. As many of you no doubt know, it's written in the cuneiform script, and it represents standard Babylonian. That's the canonical version of it. This is a dialect of Akkadian, a Semitic language. And these bits and pieces have to be assembled in a jigsaw-like puzzle. Now, unfortunately, only 2,000 of the 3,000 lines of the epic are preserved, but because Mesopotamian literary texts were copied and recopied as scribal exercises, there's hope that more and perhaps eventually the entire epic may one day be recovered. Now, when we speak of the history of Gilgamesh, it's really a story that centers around 3 Mesopotamian cities: Uruk, or not to be confused with Uruk, and Nineveh. Now, Gilgamesh hails from the city-state of Uruk. He was the king of Uruk. And Uruk is a very special place. It emerges at the end of the 4th millennium BC, or 3,500, as the world's first city, first metropolis, and is the place where writing is first invented in all likelihood. Now, Gilgamesh didn't rule at that point in time, but he ruled probably about 500, 600, 700 years later, around 2800 BC, so about easily 500 years after the invention of writing. But unfortunately, just on the cusp of history when we have the first historical texts. So often people ask, was Gilgamesh a real person? Well, we don't know for sure because we have no texts that we can relate directly to him. But there are good reasons to assume that there is a real person behind the actual legend. Now, Ur, on the other hand, was the seat of a very important dynasty at the end of the 3rd millennium. So now we're fast-forwarding again another 500-600 years down to 2100 BC. And this dynasty was known as the 3rd dynasty of Ur, or the Ur III period. And the kings of Ur claimed a very special bond with Uruk, and they commissioned several stories about Gilgamesh in the Sumerian language, which is completely unrelated to standard Babylonian. Nineveh, in this story, and I will fast forward again another 1,500 years, was, as we heard, the capital of the vast Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal, we just heard much about, was one of the greatest Mesopotamian rulers. He ruled Nineveh in the 7th century BC, and he's famous for his military exploits, of course, but he was also something of a Renaissance man, and one of the few Mesopotamian monarchs to claim literacy. At his capital, in Nineveh, he established one of the great libraries of antiquity, Library of Ashurbanipal, and it's from this library that we have the best preserved copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So our story begins at Ur around 2100 BC during this Ur III period. Now, as I mentioned, the rulers of Ur claimed a special bond with the early Uruk rulers, particularly with Gilgamesh, even though these rulers ruled Uruk preceded them by a good 500-600 years. But at Ur, they saw Uruk at the time of Gilgamesh as sort of a heroic Sumerian golden age. And they saw themselves as the heirs and stewards of this ancient tradition. The Ur III kings sought to legitimize their own rule by constantly connecting themselves with Uruk and its bygone rulers, and with Gilgamesh in particular. The dynasty's greatest ruler was Shulgi, who consolidated the incipient empire that he inherited from his father. Shulgi, who frequently referred to himself as brother friend of Gilgamesh, was like Ashurbanipal some 1,500 years later, literate and had a special penchant for learning. So it comes as no surprise that given the spirit of the Ur-3 period generally, and Shulgi's inclinations for education in particular, that it was during this period that a cycle of poems celebrating Gilgamesh and his exploits was first committed to writing. And no doubt these stories drew upon long-standing oral traditions that must have been in circulation since the days of the first dynasty of Uruk. So there are actually 5 primary Sumerian Gilgamesh stories. Now, likely these poems were composed to be performed at court before Shulgi and others, and perhaps they were set to music. But these stories have a very laconic, abrupt style, suggesting that they were probably abbreviations of traditional oral compositions. And one possible purpose for writing down of these poems may have been for training singers and for preserving the outline of an oral performance. So what was the historical development of Gilgamesh? Well, it needs to be pointed out that these Sumerian stories, they share a broad theme of Gilgamesh, but they're largely disconnected from one another. There's no such thing as a Sumerian Gilgamesh epic. It was only in the Old Babylonian period, with the first Akkadian version of Gilgamesh, that we have the first true epic of Gilgamesh, and this is the Old Babylonian version of the epic of Gilgamesh. And what this represents, it pulled together all of these Sumerian sources and added a lot more that wasn't in the original Sumerian stories, had no counterpart in them, and it brought it together into sort of a coherent whole. Now, the Old Babylonian version of Gilgamesh is far from complete, but it's a poem of tremendous beauty and power. And the opening line of this story, and this served as the title for compositions in antiquity, the first time was the title, is translated as "the one who is greatest among kings." And this is really a very apt title, because the poem is really a hymn to heroism and knightly might. Now, in the Middle Babylonian period, so that we're fast-forwarding now to the second half of the second millennium, so 1600 to 1000 BC, Gilgamesh spreads throughout the ancient Near East, as Akkadian becomes the lingua franca of the Near East. It spreads to northern Mesopotamia, it spreads to Anatolia, and it takes on various versions and translations. What happens then around 1300 to 1000 is very important, because then what we have now is the canonization of Gilgamesh. We have all of these disparate versions, and then at the end of the second millennium, the story is eventually canonized, and it's written in a literary dialect, Standard Babylonian, that was actually never spoken. And when you go and you buy the Epic of Gilgamesh at a bookstore, what you're reading is this canonical version that was written at this period. Now, this story, the canonical version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, is attributed by ancient sources to a scribe and exorcist by the name of Sin-Lucky-Unini, who may have been the principal editor of the text, who pulled together all of this ancient material and crafted this one canonical version, perhaps. It's a very different story than the one that we have in the Old Babylonian period. And again, the very first line of the story reflects this. The Standard Babylonian version places emphasis on Gilgamesh's acquisition of wisdom and self-knowledge through hard experience and personal suffering. It's a somber reflection, a less confident and more introspective story. And again, you see this in the first line. He who saw the deep, the foundations of the land, which contrasts very nicely with the earlier Old Babylonian title. Now, one of the things we're interested in is how Sin-Lucky-Unini, if we can trust that ancient attribution, changed the epic. So in addition to shaping and refocusing the theme and mood of the epic, he or another made a number of concrete changes that we can identify. For instance, we have this beautiful sweeping prologue at the beginning of the epic that portrays it as the autobiography of Gilgamesh. This didn't exist in earlier versions. The transformation of Enkidu, who plays a very minor role in the early Sumerian stories, and now he's elevated to Gilgamesh's counterpart and sort of his alter ego. And we have the addition of the final tablet of the epic, this mysterious tablet 12, which is really an appendix to the 11th tablet epic. And it's a literal translation of one of these earlier Sumerian stories, Gilgamesh Enkidu in the Netherworld. And he did this as a show, probably of scholarly erudition, to underscore the mortality theme of the epic. Now, more generally, Sinleki Nini's conceptualization of the epic is reflected in the very structure of the narrative. The travels of Gilgamesh come to encapsulate the known world, or symbolic of the universality of the epic. That is, the sort of all-encompassing theme of the epic is reflected in the physical action of the narrative, with Uruk, the city par excellence, serving as the anchor and focal point. The first half of the epic, tablets 3 through 5, are really an adventure story out west, right? The travels are all done in the western part of Mesopotamia, and the Near Eastern world. The second half is a search for this antediluvian wisdom, the wisdom of Utnapishti in the mythical East. So, what I would like to devote the remainder of this talk to and conclude with is the discovery of Gilgamesh after it was lost for 2 millennia. Now, the event, as I mentioned at the outset, is bookended by 2 Assyrians, one ancient and one modern. And I've already mentioned, we've heard mention already of the great 7th century Assyrian king Ashurbanipal and his famous library at the capital of Nineveh. Ashurbanipal, as I mentioned, was known for his claims to literacy and his love of learning, and you can see him boasting about it in this quote, and of course, his famous library. Now, the library, actually, here there's a letter from Ashurbanipal asking his agents to collect materials for the library. The library actually began modestly with texts involving omens, but eventually it grew to at least 25,000 tablets. You can see he went far and wide to collect this material. It included literary compositions and other records of all kinds, and included multiple copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh. There are probably at least 4 copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh in Ashurbanipal's library, and that, in fact, is our main source for the Epic, comes from this library. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, the royal palace, and with it the library, were burnt. The library was collapsed to the foundations of the building, sending 25,000 tablets plunging into the palace foundations, and they rested there undisturbed for 2,500 years. Now, fast forward to the middle of the 19th century, and we have the birth of ancient Near Eastern archaeology. And a few things are happening at this point. We have the decipherment of cuneiform by Rawlinson and others. The French and British, often in competition with one another, begin excavating Assyrian capitals, which were known from mentions in the Bible and classical sources. But our interests lie in the pioneering excavations of Nineveh, by Austin Henry Layard in the mid-19th century. Now, he was primarily, at this point, these were really treasure seekers, right? They're interested in sculpture. And these were shipped back to the British Museum, including, you can see here, these, what we just heard about, a lot about Lamassus, were shipped back to the British Museum, and they also incidentally found some tablets as well. Layard's finds, these were a sensation in the United Kingdom. You can see them moving one of these Lamassus into the British Museum. There's a caricature of Layard as writing on one of these bowls when he started his political career. These were, many of these, actually some of these drawings were actually made by Layard. He was an artist. You can see him here in the lower left image actually drawing. These were very destructive archaeological treasure hunting operations and a very destructive tunneling at Nineveh and Khorsabad that they engaged in to find these things. It was just how archaeology was done at the time. But Layard actually didn't work alone. He had an assistant who would go on to become his archaeological successor, Hamus Rassam, who would play a critical role in Near Eastern archaeology and is really one of its unsung heroes. Rassam was an ethnic Assyrian born in Mosul, a Chaldean Christian, who was actually hired by Layard as a paymaster in 1845. Laird was highly impressed with Rassam, and the two became something of a father figure to Rassam, and the two remained friends for the next 50 years until Laird's death. Eventually, Rassam would succeed Laird, and the British Museum entrusted Rassam with heading its excavations in Iraq. Now, the fieldwork was conducted between 1852 and 54, where Rassam really made a number of astonishing discoveries. In fact, it was Rassam, not Laird, who excavated Ashurbanipal's library and palace, and discovered all the tablets that would go on to make the nucleus of the British Museum's fantastic tablet collection. And so it was Rassam who actually discovered the Epic of Gilgamesh. Here you see two portraits of Rassam that he sat for at the age of 25, just before he became director of the British Museum excavations, and they really contrast the contrast of Middle Eastern and European dress symbolizes really the ambivalence in Rassam's life. He belonged to both worlds in name, but in reality, in the end, unfortunately, to neither. Now, Rassam's fortunes changed for the worse once he returned to England, where he found that in the press, his colleagues in the field at the British Museum were either claiming his discoveries for themselves or crediting his accomplishments to others. And really, this was an issue of cultural prejudice in Victorian England, where many couldn't accept that a Middle Easterner had made contributions of this kind. He was often described, for instance, as a digger, with Laird as the brains behind the operation. And this prejudice was to plague him the rest of his life. After a disastrous stint in politics, Rassam resumed his archaeological career later in life, and he made more important finds at Balamat and Sippar. However, he entered into a very public dispute with this man in the lower right, Budge of the British Museum, who actually accused him of stealing artifacts. There was no evidence for this, of course. Rassam sued Budge for slander in a very famous lawsuit in 1893 that was a sensation in the UK, covered by the press. He won the lawsuit, but was awarded almost nothing in damages. He retired in Brighton in debt, embittered, embarrassed, and largely forgotten. But the field has, however, been kinder to him in recent years, and there's been a real effort to restore Rassam and his position in the field. Now, as for the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, after it was discovered, we have to fast forward 20 years from Rassam's discovery of Ashurbanipal's library. We have to remember or know that Laird and Rassam couldn't read the tablets that they found. Right? The decipherment of Akkadian was in its infancy. Enter a genius by the name of George Smith from a working class family, limited formal education, fascinated with biblical history and the sensational Assyrian finds that were being made at the time. He spent his lunch hours at the British Museum training under Rawlinson, who was one of the principal decipherers of Akkadian, and the father of Assyriology. George eventually got a position at the British Museum and began looking through this vast tablet collection for a sensational tablet that would make him a star and make a big splash in the world. It took him 5 years to find it, sifting through these tablets. But in 1872, he found it, sorting through the thousands of tablets in Ashurbanipal's library. He found the best preserved manuscript of Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh, which just so happens recounts the flood. And this was an absolutely sensational find, as it not only corroborated the biblical account of the flood, but it predated it, and so showed that a major episode of Genesis had earlier Mesopotamian origins. You can see here in this quote from Budge, Rawlinson's reaction upon finding the tablet, where he sort of took his clothes off in a state of great excitement. Some people now actually think he was suffering an epileptic fit, so maybe it's a different spin on this. To conclude, Smith presented his findings at a very public meeting at the Society of Biblical Archaeology, where even Prime Minister Gladstone was in attendance. It made international news. Actually, you can see it here. The Daily Telegraph was so impressed with Smith's famous lecture on the flood that they actually funded him to go back to Rassam's old trenches to find missing pieces of the flood story. And that's really an incredible thing to ask if you're familiar with these things, because it's like literally finding a needle in a haystack, finding another bit of a tablet. But actually, he succeeded in he found a portion of a text that wasn't Gilgamesh, but a related text, but filled an important gap. This was a sensational success for the Daily Telegraph that was funding this excavation. They couldn't ask for a better outcome. We found it on the second or third day of returning to Iraq. However, he was a victim of his own success, because once they had the tablet they were looking for, they canceled the expedition in the end. So George Smith, in 1876, on a return trip to Iraq, he fell ill in Aleppo and actually, unfortunately, died at a very young age of 36. Which brings us to the end of our story, and I would just point out some further reading if you're interested. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I hope you all do or have, you should read the translation, exceptional translation of Andrew George. I think it's the only one you should read. And then there are a number of other very nice books on Assyrian legacy. There's another one by Louis Troller Larson called The Conquest of Assyria, which is excellent, but I think, unfortunately, out of print, they're very expensive. There's Empires of the Plain, which recounts the early pioneering efforts of ancient Near Eastern archaeology. And the Buried Book is a book about Gilgamesh, and it recounts in very nice detail the era of Robinson and Rassam, and it's a fascinating story that was their lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Woods, and for all of us, for those of us who have read Gilgamesh, is definitely an inspiration. Go back to it. Thank you. So now we have Professor Simo Papola, Professor Emeritus of Assyriology at the University of Helsinki. He specializes in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. His research interests encompass all aspects of Assyrian language, culture, and history, especially Assyrian religion, royal ideology, and sciences. The Melamu project, which he initiated, investigates the continuity, transformation, and diffusion of Assyrian and Babylonian culture throughout the ancient world. In addition to his academic activities, Professor Papola has also worked for the benefit of oppressed and persecuted modern Assyrians, and is co-founder and chairman of the Finland-Assyria Association. Professor Papola.
Ladies and gentlemen, Assyria is known from the Bible as a great military power, oppressing the Near East for centuries, only to be utterly destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth in the end. This notion of Assyria is still very common, but it is misleading and wrong. The Assyrian Empire was much more than just a crude military power, and when it fell, it by no means meant the end of Assyria and Assyrians, nor the end of the empire. I have planned my talk so that we will begin with having a look at what happened to Assyria and Assyrians after the fall of empire, and then continue with a look at the organization of the empire at its heyday. We will see that the ideological and administrative structures and methods needed to keep everything going did not disappear, but remained in place even after the fall of Assyria. They were as vital to the fall of all subsequent empires as they had been to Assyria, and thus came to have a profound and lasting impact on the afterworld, both in the West and the East. The Assyrian Empire was the United States of its time. It was a large, multi-ethnic, scientifically and technologically advanced country, and certainly the most powerful country in the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Like the United States, it had been born, it grew from humble beginnings by conquest. But through a very efficient and effective policy of integration, it was able to unify the country to a homogeneous whole, sharing a common language, the Imperial Aramaic, which was sort of equivalent of American English, which was spoken all over the empire by people who had long since forgotten their ethnic origins and shared the values, religion, and ideology of the empire. Even the ruling class, which traced its origins in the Old Akkadian Empire of the 3rd millennium BC, and spoke mainly Assyrian, was totally bilingual, and probably some of the elite who were of other ethnic origins also shared the ideas of the empire. This is very important to keep in mind when we look at what happened after the fall of Assyria. Well, you already have seen pictures of the Assyrian Empire. What we have here is just the extent of Assyria's provincial administration. Actually, Assyria was considerably larger if we count in the vassal states, such as Lydia and Phrygia in the Anatolian area, and Urartu, now Armenia, to the north of Assyria. In fact, Assyria's indirect influence extended much farther than the so-called Tor area until the Iranian peninsula, let's say now Spain. It was the Phoenicians who were Assyrians' vassals, acted for Assyrians in their commercial enterprises, and for instance opened silver mines in Spain, which were important to the empire. Now, Assyria fell, as we have heard, when Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC as a result of a long power struggle among the ruling elite, which started with two sons of Yasovarman fighting for power, and then ended up involving the whole ruling elite, including Assyrian governors in southern Babylonia and Media. In 612, Nineveh was sacked and razed to the ground, and the country was divided into two parts. The Medes, who actually carried out the destruction of Nineveh, carried away all the parts of the government that were not able to escape from the city, and deported much know-how, not only from Nineveh but also from Ashur to their capital, Ecbatana, in western Iran. The Babylonians, under the leadership of Nabopolassar, took the western part of the empire, including Assyrian areas in the Levant and Anatolia. So it's important to remember here that the actual seat of Assyrian government remained on the Median side, and thus the Medes were able to claim universal kingship, that is, here as heirs to the Assyrians, whereas the Babylonians, who in fact were just part of the old empire, could only claim the kingship of Babylon, because they were not on the scene when Assyria fell. Well, apart from the shift of the power to Ecbatana and Babylon, and the liquidation of much of the Assyrian nobility, nothing much happened elsewhere, otherwise in the empire. Life went on as it had been, and both the Babylonians, and especially the Babylonians, pursued the Assyrian policies before the fall, including, for instance, the deportations, as we know very well from the Bible. So here we have a map of the new division of the empire. I must point out here that the areas controlled by Media, which are much larger than actually Assyria ever controlled, they are more loosely organized than in the Assyrian Empire, and consisted of all sorts of tributary arrangements between the Medes and other Median tribes. Some have even contested that Median, its empire, actually ever existed, but I believe there was an empire, and in fact it was very much Assyrian, probably not only in organization, but also in its habits, as we learn from later historiographers. Well, some 70 years after Assyria's fall, both Media and Neo-Babylonian Empire came under the control of Cyrus the Great, who now became the single king, great king of the countries earlier ruled by Assyria. It's incredible, but despite the time that had elapsed since the fall of Assyria, the Persians under Cyrus and his followers proved to be even more faithful followers than the Babylonians and Medes before them of Assyrian practices. The former Assyrian area was preserved under its former name, Asura, in the form of 4 satrapies, but actually only one mega satrapy controlled by the same family, which had ruled it under the Babylonian kingship. The Median half also was combined into 4 satrapies consisting of Media, Elam, and then Cyrus's home country, Persia. Assyrian practices and manners perpetuate everywhere. And we have, for instance, the Greek historiographer Xenophon's eyewitness witness descriptions of the life in the court of the Achaemenids, which really shows how unchanged everything went on. Here is the provincial division of the Median Empire. You see Assyria, along with Abar-Nahara, which is the old Assyrian, Ebernari, the designation for the Trans-Euphratean provinces. And here's an telling example of how exactly and faithfully the Persian kings followed the Assyrian model. These are two depictions of the royal audience at the New Year's festival, one from Tilbars in Assyria to the left, 740 BC, and the second is the Persian king Darius seated on the throne in Persepolis, 30 years later. The only thing here that really differs is some details in the throne, but we have similar representations of Assyrian throne, also from Assyria. And the fact that the Persians, despite the destruction brought in Nineveh, were able to so faithfully copy Assyrian styles is explained by the fact that it was the Assyrian sculptors who actually executed these reliefs for the Persians, as is told in the Persian inscriptions also. And we have also ethnographic documents from Susa recording the payments made by the Assyrian artists. Now, after Alexander the Great's defeat of the Achaemenids, he established a Part1 empire, as you all know, which extended far to India. But this did not last long, since Alexander died soon, and it was divided by generals who each started to compete for power and established their own empires. The most successful of his followers was Seleucus, who in fact re-established Syria, the day. And the area of the Seleucid Empire here, as you can see, pretty closely corresponds to the former Persian Empire. Its administrative center was originally in Babylonia, in a city founded by Seleucus quite close to Babylon, and later on in Syria, Syrian Antiochia. So you see that just like Alexander had made his empire's capital Babylon, the Seleucids also continued this habit, and the weight of the empire was really in the west, in former Assyrian central areas. The Macedonians who held power soon were very much Mesopotamized, and it's quite clear that some of them started speaking Aramaic, which remained the official language. And even though they perpetuated Hellenistic customs and art forms, they also favored syncretism with Mesopotamia. cuneiform libraries in Babylonia, so the historical knowledge of Mesopotamia was preserved, and also the Mesopotamians and Assyrians made their culture known to the Greeks in the form of a history written by the priest Berosus in 2180. Then finally, a few words about Mesopotamia and Roman rule. What is important to keep in mind is that at the time when Romans entered into the scene, the Seleucid Empire had been started to dwindle under the attack of the Parthians, and actually it comprised only at this time the area of present-day Syria. And when it was annexed by Rome, it became the Roman province of Syria in this extent. In the other areas of former Mesopotamia, some areas had become semi-independent kingdoms under the Parthians. For instance, also ANB in Syria and AUA-America in the east, in the area where we have nowadays Erbil, for instance. When the Roman constitution was changed from republic into dictatorship, there started a flood influx of Oriental influence into the Roman court. And already from the first Roman emperors on, there were several Syrian or Mesopotamian advisors in the Roman court, called the Magi and Chaldeans. These were astrologers, but they continued as the advisors of the emperor as in Mesopotamia before. Despite all appearances, all Mesopotamian cultural traditions continue still in Syria, now called Roman province, and we have several ancient live descriptions of life there, for instance by Lucian, who calls himself by Assyrian, or Tatian, the author of the first Syriac or Aramaic Gospel, Diatessaron, who claims he was born in Syria and despises the Greek culture, saying that the Greeks have inherited everything from the Assyrians. Until this point, Hellenistic Roman and Greek writers have not distinguished between Syria and Assyria. But from the point that Syria became a Roman province, the name Syria, which is actually only an abbreviation of Assyria, became to denote just this geographical area, while the Assyrians started to be applied to the former empire. Here is an example of the cultural continuity in Roman Syria. We have here Assyrian priests of Baal officiating in Europos in 50 BC, the same old Assyrian guru, and still wearing the same sort of caps as the Assyrian priests 700 years earlier. well, the Assyrians had on the formerly median side of the Tigris still remained outside of the Roman province Syria, because the Romans did not pay off to annex areas that far, but they were shortly annexed by the Assyrians, by the Romans, first by Trajan, and then by the Septimius Severus, who established in Rome a dynasty that really transferred the center of Roman Empire from Rome to the east. And under this emperor started the development that eventually led to the division of the Roman Empire into the eastern and Roman part, and transformed the Byzantine culture to very close to the old Assyrian heritage in religious terms. But on the other hand, these influences also were transmitted to the West through the Roman Empire and the establishment of Christianity in Rome. Okay, now let's move to the considering the Assyrian statecraft. I will go through. Yes. Well, I'm afraid I will have to skip my presentation because I wasted too much time on the preservation of Assyrian identity in post-empire times. But I consider that a very important point because it shows how everything that we find as Assyrian influence in later times was not due to borrowing or, let's say, not intimate contact with Assyria, but really through a historical point, historical development, where everything passed on structurally and naturally to the later generations. I will now just shortly show you the remaining slides that I have prepared. Unfortunately, the time does not permit to discuss. Well, as you can see, there should have been stuff for much longer talk. Here, at this point, I just would like to say that these Assyrian art motifs are to be seen everywhere in nowadays and last century's official buildings. For example, also here, the parliaments and lotuses, etc. Thank you very much.